So Lawrence Lessig is a professor at Harvard Law School, and it is also, again, a real huge honor for me to introduce Lessig, because indeed this is during a class at Harvard with Lessig and Professor Zitrain that I actually started. I did my first presentation on Ethereum, and I started actually being interested in this space, which was about like 2 years ago. And it's actually amazing now to be able to invite Lessig to this conference and to actually somehow see how much has happened in just those few years. So please go ahead.
So early in my career, I learned you should never give a talk at a place where everybody in the audience knows more than you do about the subject. But I am so late in my career that I've forgotten all the things I learned early in my career. So I agreed when Primavera asked me to come fling myself across the globe to speak about this subject. But I'm happy to be here, and I've found this day extraordinarily interesting. And I want to try to relate what you're all going through today and in this process of discovering and articulating the blockchain philosophies to an earlier debate that was the beginning of the law of cyberspace. Okay, so I wanted to find a metaphor or a frame, and the frame I found was about weddings. I don't know why. I'm not getting married. I've been married. I don't know anybody else who's getting married, but here it is. I'm going to give you something old, something new, something borrowed, and something blue. So here's something old. It was more than 15 years ago I published this book, Code and Other Laws of Cyberspace, and the core argument I wanted to make in that book was code is law. Or in the font that I was using of the day, here it is, code is law. And the argument of this phrase was really two things. Number one, to get people to reflect on the different things that regulate our behavior. And then secondly, to see the way law affects those different things that regulate our behavior. So first, the things that regulate those behavior. And I'm going to give you actually the original slides. These are authentic original slides. So the core idea is to focus on the target of regulation, this pathetic red dot, you and me, or companies, or whatever. The thing that the governments are trying to control, this red dot. And the first intuition lawyers have about the regulation of this pathetic red dot is the way that the law regulates this pathetic red dot. And the law regulates with a certain modality. The law says something like, do not murder. And do not murder is an ex ante regulation. We give you that regulation before you think about committing this crime. And if you cross the rule, then the rule is enforced by the state. That's the architecture of legal regulation. But once you think about the law as a regulator, you can recognize there are other regulators too. So think about the way that norms regulate. And just to show you how out of date these slides are, here's the example I came up with when I thought about norms regulating, an example that you wouldn't say today. For example, I would think there's a norm that says that I should not wear a dress when I come talk to you. Now, in California, that's ambiguous now, but other parts of the world, still pretty clear, I should not wear a dress. Now, what kind of regulation is that? Well, like law, it's an ex ante regulation. I know it before it happens. But it's not enforced by the state, it's enforced by the community. It's you who would look at me a little bit puzzled. Why am I wearing a blue satin dress as I try to speak to you here? This is the community that enforces this rule, this regulation. And then we can think about the way the market is a regulator of this pathetic red dot. The different constraints or opportunities or affordances of different prices for behavior. Pay me $300 and I'll sing, or maybe you'll pay me $3,000 and I won't sing. These are different ways of directing me, of changing my behavior, and it functions like a regulation. But unlike norms and law, this is not ex ante, it's kind of simultaneous. It's a set of incentives given to me at the moment, and it's enforced by the systems of property and contract. Those are systems, of course, created by the law. But the regulation that I focused on as most important in understanding the way the law of cyberspace would develop is to think about the way architecture regulates. The architecture, the found environment. We know that architecture in physical space. So this is the perfect architecture for a lecture at a university, because there are no windows. Because if there are windows, the bored students would spend all their time looking out to the stuff going on the outside, but we constrain them to focus them on the person up front. Of course, now they have laptops in their laps and they're looking at thousands of windows at the same time the professor is trying to lecture. But this is an architectural constraint, and its objective is to focus you. It's a way of constraining you. And like the market, it's simultaneous with your existence, but the effect, the force, is enforced by God, if there is a God, or something like this. So my favorite example is from an MIT t-shirt, 186,000 meters per second. It's not just a good idea, it's the law, right? The speed of light, it's a law. So these four regulations, these four modalities work together to constrain us or to create affordances or opportunities for us. And the first point of code and other laws of cyberspace was to bring these out as the different things which regulate. Okay, but the problem with this framing for a law professor is it makes the law seem really small, insignificant, bad thing for a law professor, because, law is just one of four. And so then it became really important to think, well, how could we make law not just one of four? And that's when I recognized that, of course, laws affect the things that regulate. So think about the objective of regulating smoking, which again, 15 years ago was still pretty contested, but in the United States now basically people are banned to Siberia if they smoke. But think about the way the law went about trying to regulate smoking. The first thing the law did was to have laws, which constrained who could smoke or who could buy cigarettes. That's a traditional direct way that the law regulated smoking. But then the law got a little bit more creative. The law said, well, what if we regulated the norms that existed in a society to change the way people thought of other people who were smoking? So California had a series of ads that made people who smoked seem pathetic in California's eyes because they were weak, they were vulnerable to this addiction, and they were not healthy, and they were polluting their children's lives. This was all an effort to change the norms around the idea of smoking. Or think about the use of market to regulate smoking by radically increasing the cost of cigarettes. Of course, in the United States, we also subsidize tobacco, but put that aside. This is an effort to raise the price, which therefore constrains the opportunity to buy cigarettes and therefore drives some people at least away from smoking. And maybe most interesting were efforts to regulate the architecture of literally cigarettes. In the United States, for a while, the FDA was thinking about regulating cigarettes as nicotine delivery devices. And as a nicotine delivery device, they would have the authority to regulate the amount of nicotine. If they could reduce the amount of nicotine, that would change the addictiveness of cigarettes, thereby once again reinforcing the objective to reduce the amount of smoking. All four of these different modalities working together to this common state end. Okay, so the point, or maybe the points here, were number one, the law obviously was significant in this because the question the regulator constantly faces is which mix of modalities works best. And the law affects the mix. The trade-offs among these modalities are the things that regulators should be thinking about as they decide, should we tax, should we regulate, should we try to muck about with norms, or should we change the frame, the context, the architecture within which this behavior occurs. And number two, important for what I want to talk about today, the architecture of a space has consequences. It has policy consequences. The architecture will enable regulation or disable regulation. It will enable privacy or disable privacy. It will be one of the tools that affect the environment within which people function. Okay, when I published this book in 1999, I feared most that everything I was saying would seem completely obvious. But I was motivated. I had an obvious target when I published that book. I had been triggered to write that book by this incredible statement of my friend John Perry Barlow. I'm going to have him read a little bit of this to you here.
A Declaration of the Independence of Cyberspace, as written by John Perry Barlow at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, on February 8th, 1996.
How many people know Barlow? Just raise your hand.
Governments of the industrial world, you weary giants of flesh and steel, I come from cyberspace, the new home of mind. On behalf of the future, I ask you of the past to leave us alone. You are not welcome among us. You have no sovereignty where we gather.
Okay, so Barlow was a former writer for the Grateful Dead, and he was one of the founders of the EFF. And what he was articulating in the 1990s was this vision the EFF embraced at that time, that cyberspace was the great home for libertarianism, that there would be this place that governments just could not touch, could not regulate, a space that protected freedom of speech, protected privacy, and was immune from government's regulation because of the nature of the place. And he expresses it in this following paragraph, just 3 lines that I want to pick on him for here.
Your legal concepts of property, expression, identity, movement, and context do not apply to us. They are based on matter. There is no matter here.
Okay, now this is a really romantic idea. We'd be freed from the government because we all went to cyberspace, but it betrayed a really important confusion. And the confusion is this: whether the legal concepts applied to us doesn't depend on whether we are existing in matter. Whether the legal concepts applied to us depended on the architecture within which we were living, the architecture. The internet, as it was originally constructed, was an architecture of freedom. It protected freedom of speech. It protected privacy. It gave the owners of the internet no easy way to identify who was doing what where, because those components of regulation were not built into the protocol of TCP/IP. It was just nothing that anyone could know. That was the nature of that peer-to-peer infrastructure. But the point that I thought they missed was that this architecture of freedom could become an architecture of control. It could, if changed, and I predicted it would, because both business and government would rather have an infrastructure of the internet that they could monitor or police. Business and government, I said in code and other laws of cyberspace, would therefore cooperate to create an architecture of control, an architecture where it was easier to regulate behavior, to monitor what people were doing, to invade the privacy of people as they lived on the net. And the key to this argument was to recognize that the regulability, a word which apparently I made up. I thought it was a word, but there it is, a word I made up, by which I mean the ability of government to regulate its citizens. Regulability is constructed, and it could be changed. The basic infrastructure enabled or disabled the opportunity to regulate, and that infrastructure could be changed. All of that seemed obvious to me, but it wasn't obvious. As I started to go around talking about this, I once gave this talk, and a woman came up to me literally crying, an engineer, software engineer. She said to me, "I don't do politics. That's not what I do. So don't tell me that when I'm writing code, I'm actually writing rules that are like law. It's not law. I'm just writing code." And then when my book was reviewed by the great David Pogue, Pogue was not convinced in this New York Times review. What Pogue said is, Lessig plays digital Cassandra. He predicts that the internet will become a monster that tracks our every move, but that nobody will heed his warning. These discussions are thoughtful and measured, but the premise that frames them all is shaky. Lessig doesn't offer much proof that a Soviet-style loss of privacy and freedom is on its way. And anyway, unlike actual law, internet software has no capacity to punish. It doesn't affect people who aren't online, and only a tiny minority of the world population is. And if you don't like the internet system, you can always flip off the modem. Now, I never knew what sense of flip off he meant, whether he meant the switch or this sense of flip off. But the problem is, sadly, David Pogue was wrong. Right? The 2000s were the decade of compromise for these deep values of the internet. 9/11 in the United States triggers it for the United States. It triggers government's constant demand that these providers of internet service compromise, or we could say engage in corruption of this core integrity to the values of the original internet. These core systems of the net became compromised as business caved to the threats and the bribes of government to change the infrastructure, the architecture, the very code to enable much simpler surveillance or control over what happened on the internet. And the result of this was to produce a net that was less secure, gave less privacy, and more control than the original internet did. Maybe not Soviet-style loss of free privacy and freedom, because unlike the Soviet system, this surveillance system actually worked. Okay. Now, the lesson here should be clear, right? Law and business made the net more regulable, which meant that the weary giants of flesh and steel, at least in this respect, still could rule. Okay, that's the old stuff. Here's something that I think is new. I flung myself across this world to apply some of that analysis to this experience in this phenomenon which we're talking about as the blockchain, which the economist thinks gets best represented through this clever little graphic. But I'm here as a student. I don't pretend to be an expert about the blockchain. But what I want to see is if there's a way for us to avoid the same mistakes, whether those same mistakes could be avoided, the mistakes that we made 20 years ago at the birth of the internet, with obliviousness of those in the technical community to the way in which the law would react to what they were building. I believe I come here as a fan of the blockchain. I think it is the most important innovation in fundamental architecture since the tubes of the internets were first developed. It has enormous potential to bypass corruption, to bypass fraud, to improve efficiency, to enhance freedom. But its potential is not just technical. Its potential is also political. It has a radical potential to improve governance and a radical potential to increase what we should call the governance gap. The gap between the behavior of citizens and the government's ability to regulate the behavior. What the blockchain in its most ambitious conception can do is to make it radically more difficult for the government to do what the government wants to do with its population. The thing to recognize is the blockchain, the code of the blockchain is doing both. It's Janus-faced, just like the internet was Janus-faced. And to recognize and understand this fact up front, so that as we watch and push and develop the blockchain, we don't make the mistakes that we made in the context of the internet. The blockchain here, of course, then is, as I was describing it, an architecture too. It's an architecture that affects the regulability of life within the context or the environment of the blockchain. So like the original internet, it's a P2P infrastructure, which means, like the original internet, it's architected to have no regulator in the middle, or no regulator was designed to be within the middle, which means it is an architecture of freedom initially. But this is where I begin to get this feeling of déjà vu. Because as I hear many people, not many here, but many people write about the blockchain, there once again is this libertarian fallacy that is emerging around the context and the conversation about this architecture. The fallacy, it isn't regulable as it is now, which means that it can't be regulated, right? But the lesson of the peer-to-peer version 1, that's the internet, or peer-to-peer version 2, that's file sharing technologies, is that the law is not going away, and that it will use its tools, however crude those tools are, to close a governance gap. Or again, the law will use its tools, however crude those tools are, to increase the regulability of behavior affected by this basic platform architecture. And so what the world needs now It's not love. The world does need love, but what the world needs now is a certain understanding. And I want to give two senses of that: the law understanding code and code understanding law. And that's my job here, to facilitate a little bit of the beginning of the conversation to enable both sides of that understanding. So number one, law meet code, meet blockchain code. And what we should tell law when law meets this blockchain code is that this code is offering many things, but the one I want to focus on right now is radical efficiency. By efficiency, I mean something very specific. I mean the ability to do much more with less. And the biggest beneficiary, the focus that I think we need to make to understand why we cannot imagine a world without the blockchain, the biggest beneficiary of this efficiency will be the poor around the world. We live in a world wrecked by corruption. And what we need is technology to eliminate the need for trust in a world where we are wrecked by corruption. And the benefits of this infrastructure are most pronounced for those without trust to give, those who live in environments where they can't offer others the trust that others need to be willing to engage in commercial transactions with them. So for us, or at least those of us living in rich nations like the United States, this is not as critical a problem, right? Because we have plenty of trust-obviating technologies, technologies that make it not necessary for someone to trust you or me as I want to engage in transactions with them. Legal technologies like laws that say credit card holders will only be liable for up to $50 if their credit card is stolen, or literal technologies built into the credit card to make it easy for businesses engaging in transactions to be confident there's going to be a payment at the other end without needing to rely on the trust to any individual. But for them, for the poor around the world, they don't have these technologies that obviate the need for trust. They have banks they can't trust, they have governments they can't trust, they have currencies they can't trust, and the rest of the world can't trust them. So that gain, the gain to the poor, in my view, should be enough for us to recognize that the law has no option to imagine a future that doesn't have pervasive blockchain technology in the basic infrastructure architecture of our world. It will be, it needs to be the future, and the question is just how the law and this technology will live together. That's number one. So then number two, the other side. Code meet law, or let me offer a less caricatured view of the law than is typical among technologists who talk about the law. Because, I've known law now for about 30 years. And I feel she's a misunderstood and underappreciated force in our society. And I want to make three claims about this misunderstood and underappreciated force. Number one, I want to argue that the imperfections in the law are not all imperfect. The things which technologists see when they see the law are actually not imperfections, even though from the logical, formal space that you come from, they look like confusions and imperfections. Number two, that escape from the law is almost futile. And number three, that escape is often just wrong. Okay, let's start with number one. The imperfections are not all perfect. There's something we famously in America call the Bronx cheer, which is something like this. I often see when I talk to people about the law, I talk to technologists about the law, a sort of geek sneer. Not the Bronx sneer, a geek sneer. When people look at the law, because what the technologists typically say when they look at law, they look at contracts in particular, is what an absurd mess. Confusions and ambiguities and inconsistencies that make it impossible for the system to actually work efficiently. But what I want you to recognize is that in some cases, in important cases, clarity sometimes is a crime. Clarity, adding clarity, weakens the opportunity of the legal system to deliver the value that a legal system has. So here's one example. One of the greatest law professors in America, and I can only find one picture of him on the internet, so this really bad, tiny little picture. His name's Mayor Dan Cohen, wrote this fantastic article called Decision Rules and Conduct Rules on Acoustic Separation in Criminal Law. It's an idea which extends far beyond criminal law. But the basic idea of acoustic separation is that you imagine two kinds of rules in a legal system. One kind of rule is the decision rule. It's the rule the court lives by when the court decides a particular case. But separate from that rule, you imagine a conduct rule. Conduct rule is what the public thinks the law is when the public decides how the public's going to behave. And what Dan Cohen did in this brilliant article is that he argued that sometimes it's best if those rules are different, meaning what the court is told is different from what the public is told, and no one knows that they are different. It's best, Dan Cohen argues, if the rules are acoustically separated with an acoustic wall between them, so nobody on either side realizes that the rules are different. So for example, here's maybe the clearest example. A conduct rule, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, a rule that is directed to the public, would say something like, the ignorance of the law is no excuse. It's what we all think the law is. The law says if you don't know what the law is, but you've broken it, too bad, so sad, you're going to jail. But if you actually look at what judges do, the decision rule of judges is the ignorance of the law is usually an excuse. In fact, when you get to court and you're looking at the way the court works, it turns out that not having known that there was a law that you were violating is a pretty good way to get off scot-free, or at least get a much substantially reduced punishment. And what Dan Cohen was arguing is that's a good thing. It's a good thing that there's that difference. So how is it possible that there's a good thing? Well, what he says is the conduct rule that we're telling to the public creates in the public the expectation they got to work hard to know what the law is, right? Because they know that if they don't know what the law is and they break the law, they're going to jail anyway. So they have an incentive to work hard to know what the law is. But if they've actually broken the law without knowing what the law is, there's no good reason to punish that person in the same way you would punish someone who did know what the law was. That's just unjust. And it wastes resources because that person's actually not as bad as the person who knew what the law was and violated the law. So it's better for us to have these two different rules operating together in this confused and obscure way, because if it weren't confused and obscure, the opportunity to create that acoustic separation would be gone. Now, I lay that as an example because from the coder's perspective, it's hard to understand how you create a world with that kind of level of confusion intentionally built in, right? That's usually an accident, right, or a bug. But the point is, this bug is a feature that the law has, and when you see it, you should not assume immediately it serves no possible positive purpose. Or here's the second example. Think about the ambiguity, and we abbreviate contracts with the letter K, mysteriously, because of course the word contract is a C, but okay. Ambiguities in contracts. We should recognize these ambiguities in contracts are often intentional, or at least intentional with feigned obliviousness to the intentionality of them. So we know, but we can't admit that we know, that a certain clause or a certain part of our contract is deeply ambiguous. And we sign the contract anyway, pretending we don't realize there's that deep ambiguity. So how could it be sensible that we would do such a thing? And the answer is, if we had to negotiate that clause, it would be pretty costly for us to come up with an agreement about the precise way in which that clause is going to apply. The agreement would be costly, and if we imagine that that clause is a low probability event, that clause would be invoked as a low probability event, then it makes sense for us to basically outsource the resolution of that clause to the court if, in fact, we have to go litigate this contract with the small probability that, in fact, we will have to litigate the contract. So the point, again, is this imperfection from the perspective of the coder, this ambiguity, uncertainty, mess, is often part of the plan. It makes it more efficient for the two parties to come up with their agreement if they know certain things they can put to the side and trust the court will get the right answer if the court has to address it. Okay, that's claim one. Claim two is escape from the law is almost futile. Okay. couple points here. Number one, there's always going to be law, even in the pristine world of the blockchain. I don't know, chugs along. I don't know what blockchains do. How do blockchains move? But anyway, pile on or climb on, whatever. The verb's not clear to me. Okay, there's always going to be law. So let's take a non-blockchain example. Think about this technology, right? An old-fashioned soda machine. You walk up to the soda machine. This soda machine, you only had to put 10 cents in. You drop 10 cents into that soda machine, and it spits out a bottle of Coke. Okay, now you might look at that and you say, there's no law there. There's a mechanical device that takes one bit of metal and in response to the bit of metal being inserted in the right way, spits out, those days, a bottle of drink. So law doesn't involve itself at all in that. That's kind of living in this beautiful libertarian land where the rules are all determined by what the metal does in response to metal. But of course, this device is surrounded by contract law. If I dropped the dime in and nothing came out, I would be allowed to go and claim they've breached the implied contract that if I drop the dime in, something's going to come out. It's surrounded by product liability law. If the Coke that comes out is poisonous and I die, my estate, sad I know, my estate would have the right to sue on the basis of the fact that it wasn't a safe product that was coming out. And obviously, third, property law steps in. You can't steal the machine and run away with it, right? Because theft is not a permitted thing to be doing in this context. So the point is, even though the machine in its purest sense, in the way that people think the blockchain is functioning, is doing all of the exchange of value automatically, it's living within an environment that is governed and ruled by the law. And in obvious ways, this happens even if it's trying to imagine that it's not living within the environment. This is something a man named Craig Stephen writes. Some people called him Satoshi Nakamoto, but whether or not he's Satoshi Nakamoto, something he discovered here in Australia just this week as police officers came and broke down the doors of his house, the police officers insisted that these acts in this mechanical device, these blockchain Bitcoin acts, triggered tax law. And they trigger tax law and therefore trigger the government to intervene in the crudest intervention possible by going in and breaking into his house and seizing all of his documents to be able to prove that, in fact, he has violated Australian tax law. So to defend its money, or what it considers to be its money, the state will do everything, even though the thing that's triggering the state to act is, in a sense, like the Coke machine, this mechanical device living not self-consciously embracing the law. So that's number one. Number two, the blockchain will obviously need the law because as reflection on the fact that agreements need ambiguity and agreements need remedies should suggest, it will need courts to step in and fill gaps in the implied agreements that's being carried out by these complex machine contracts. It will need ways to deal with the contingencies that the parties really want to defer to a world where they don't hope happens, but if it happens, somebody needs to resolve those contingencies. Lots of places, ways in which the infrastructure cannot on its own express the full reach of the norms that it's trying to enforce. This is a principle of logic as much of it as it is a principle of law. And so what that means is the blockchain will exist in the infrastructure of the law and need it and depend on it. It needs to be much more open to the way it's going to interact. And then third, and I think one that's most often missed, the state is often effectively a party to the contract. It's a silent party, but it's a party nonetheless. So consider a Turing-complete platform like Ethereum. And so consider a number of ways in which, in a context like that, we can imagine different kinds of obligations arising. Here's the first one, Wimpy.
I'll have a hamburger.
Okay, so if all Wimpy says is, I'll have a hamburger, and he hands over cash for that hamburger, then trust in that context is not going to be necessary, right? There's no trust needed if you've handed over the money in exchange for the hamburger. Here's a very different Wimpy context.
I'll have a hamburger, for which I will gladly pay you Tuesday.
Okay, so if Wimpy's living in a world where there is no law, then, I can't remember his name now, something really weird. The guy who's always selling Wimpy his hamburgers, but what's his name? Brutus, right. He's going to have to trust Wimpy. Idiotically, he always does, but he's going to have to trust Wimpy to give him money next Tuesday. Okay, but with the law, less trust is needed. Less trust, not zero trust, but less trust. Because if Wimpy takes the hamburger with the promise that on Tuesday he's going to pay, the law is going to step in and say, on Tuesday, pay Wimpy, and if you don't, you've breached the implied contract. So what contract law says is that these promises will be enforced, not all promises, but quid pro quo promises will be enforced, not perfectly, not costly, but better than a system relying on trust alone. In this sense, contract law is a reduction in the need for trust within the system. But with contracts, the state or the government is getting something too. Because with contracts, the state is getting the power to decide whether the contract is a good contract, whether the terms of the contract violate some public interest, whether the court will enforce the contract. Because when the court gets the request by one party to enforce the contract, the court reads the contract and says, okay, this seems okay, I'm going to enforce that contract. Or the court reads the contract and says, hell no, I'm not going to enforce this contract. And if there's no enforcement, then all the parties have to rely on is the trust of one party to perform with the other. So for example, very famous case, Campbell Soup versus Wentz. This is a case involving Campbell Soup engaging in contracts with farmers to grow these very special orange carrots that make up the carrot soup of Campbell Soup. And they had very strict terms of the contract about how they had to sell the carrots exclusively to Campbell Soup and what the terms are in the contract. The court got this contract when the farmers sold these carrots to somebody else, read the contract and said, yeah, perfectly enforceable contract, no doubt there's an enforceable contract here, but, quote, we think it is too hard a bargain and too one-sided an agreement to entitle the plaintiff to relief in a court of conscience. So what the court has said is, yeah, there's a contract. Yeah, they broke the contract, but hell no if I'm going to enforce it because these are poor farmers and you're a rich corporation. I'm not going to have anything to do with you screwing them through these incredibly bad terms that you force them to accept. This is what sovereignty is about. The ability of the court to make that judgment, to decide it doesn't like this contract and therefore is not going to enforce it. So against that background, here's the point. Ethereum contracts, like the contract with money or the contract with a machine, make trust unnecessary. It's like coins in a slot machine. But the question it's going to raise is, what if the state doesn't like gambling? What if the state doesn't like the machine or what the machine is being used for? Or more generally, what if the state doesn't like this type of contract? Right? The Turing-complete blockchains would remove the state from the ability to veto or not, to approve or not these kinds of contracts. But what that suggests is, as with taxes, the question is whether the state's going to go quietly, be ejected quietly, depending on what the nature of the contract is. And I predict, once again, the state's not going to go quietly for certain kinds of contracts. For certain kind of contracts, the state's going to be very keen to be in the middle of those contracts because it's a state interest that the state's not going to give up. Okay, and then number 3. Escape from these contracts escape from the state is often, not always, but often wrong. It's clear that we need to recognize for the hardcore libertarians in the room, maybe there are none, but let's assume there's a few, that sometimes we actually want the state to be in the middle of the agreements that people otherwise would be making, the contracts that people otherwise would be making. So one that might be familiar to many people here, think about the rule of copyright law. Copyright law is a kind of property law. It's a property in the sense that it gives an owner an exclusive right to that property, exclusive until the owner alienates the property to someone else. But the rules of copyright of property are defined by the state. The state says how long the copyright survives, what the terms under which you're allowed to exercise that property right are. It's defined by the state everywhere around the world with a set of exceptions built in to the property rules. Exceptions that say when the property owner is not allowed to enforce his or her property right against somebody else. In the United States, we call those exceptions fair use exceptions, but around other places around the world, there are basically similar exceptions built in that the state by law defines the property owner as not allowed to evade. These exceptions express a public value. The fair use exception expresses the public value that I ought to be allowed to use a small bit of your copyrighted work, for example, for the purpose of criticizing your copyrighted work. It's the only way criticism should or could exist. It defines a public value in access. Okay, now we had in the original internet fights long discussions about the way in which technology can undermine those public values. So digital rights management technology could in principle negate this public value of access if the digital rights management technology just locks the content up so you can't get any access to any of it without express permission of the copyright owner. That's inconsistent with the idea of fair use. And so this public value that we sell digital property without protecting fair use is what DRM produced, and produced a good reason for the public value to push back against this technological innovation that interfered with the public value that was built into copyright law. And this points to a more fundamental, what I want to call anti-libertarian point, that if you think about the full range of what we typically consider the public good, it's not going to be produced as the sum of what private choices would contract to produce. Not that private choices are bad, and I think probably in most cases, what private parties would agree to in their contract is perfectly great for the public good, but it's to recognize that in some places, the public good is something more than what the private parties in a contract would agree to, beyond obvious cases like slavery or violations of minimum wage, all sorts of places where the law steps in and says, what you would otherwise agree to is not something that the public wants, and that means the public will have a reason to resist the world of purely private contracts, which is one way of conceiving of what the Turing-complete blockchain would enable. So Andreas's great book has this wonderful quote in it where he says, the invention of the blockchain and the consensus system will significantly reduce the cost of organizations and coordination in large-scale systems while removing opportunities for concentration of power, corruption, and regulatory capture. Now, this is a true statement, but interestingly incomplete. Because when talking about regulatory capture, you're talking about the bad parts of regulation that the blockchain will block. But the truth is, the blockchain can also block the good parts of regulation. It will block regulation and regulatory capture to the extent either of them are inconsistent with the values chosen by people when they engage in the contracts which the blockchain is manifesting. Sometimes that's going to be great. I'm all for evading some regulations, but I'm not going to tell you which, but often not great because they, again, violate a fundamental or important public value which the state has a reason to enforce. Okay, put these all together. This is what the conclusion is going to be about it. Number one, there's obvious ways in which the law and code are going to conflict. They did in the internet age, they will in the blockchain age. And what that conflict means is that we got to ask, are there obvious ways to mitigate that conflict? What we know the conflict will be, are there ways to avoid it or to minimize the consequence from it? Number two, not all conflicts are going to matter, but which are most important is the question we've got to identify, which must be avoided. And then number three, as we think of this ecology that will develop in a world increasingly populated by platforms that are blockchain-like platforms, we must begin to work an understanding of where there are going to be serious conflicts. And we must begin to ask, can they be avoided? And we need to begin to play a game, kind of regulatory war games, as we map out the ways in which the particular architecture that's being developed will produce a particular kind of conflict. If this platform enables X, what conflicts will that create with the state? And in that wargaming, we can't assume rationality on the government side. We can't assume rationality. All we've got to assume, and again, the image of the seizing of assets of the potential inventor of this infrastructure, as we think about that, we have to assume just raw power. And more than raw power, we need to assume raw, stupid, and corrupted power will be operating in the face of these potential conflicts. Okay, that's new. Quickly, something borrowed. Hero of mine, Henry David Thoreau, 1846, outside of Walden Pond, he writes this: "There are 1,000 hacking at the branches of evil to one who is striking at the root." Okay, I told you it was short, that's it. Now I'm going to tell you something blue. I'm going to bring that back in, but don't worry. So here's something blue. Okay. So in my career, I don't do IP anymore, either copyright or internet policy. I don't do it because of a kid. About 10 years ago, a friend, a kid named Aaron Swartz, came to visit me. You may know him either through his work or you might know him through this film, but this really extraordinary young boy came to me and he asked me a question. I had been working with him almost 8, maybe 10 years at that point. He was the original architect of the technical infrastructure of Creative Commons at the age of 13 or 14. That was after he had developed the protocol with David Weiner for RSS. But so he came to me with this question. He said to me, how are you going to ever make progress on the things that I was working on, copyright policy, internet policy, how are you ever going to make progress in that, given the deep corruption that is our government? I was a little miffed by his question, because I was showing him the work I was doing. I was proud of this book that I was just finishing, and I pushed back. I said, Aaron, it's not my field. And he said, you mean as an academic? I said, yeah, as an academic, it's not my field. He said, okay, but what about as a citizen? Is it your field as a citizen? And this was Aaron's character. Like a child's hug, his question spoke more clearly than anything anyone could have said with words. And that question changed me. That night, he and I agreed I was going to give up. He has this hypnosis. I don't know how he did it, but that night, I agreed I was going to give up my work on IP, copyright and internet policy, and take up this project of attacking this deep corruption that is both in our government and lots of institutions in our society. That summer, I announced at the Creative Commons conference that was the end of my work in this field, and he and I started a group called Change Congress to begin that work in the fall. Now, his question, the question he asked me, is a critical question here too. Because however much apologists like me talk about the ideal government policy, which is what I was talking about when I was trying to defend the idea that the state will need to be defended against the infrastructure of the blockchain, it's just that kind of apologist-like argument. However much apologists make that argument, what we all must recognize is what Aaron was getting me to see, the point that Henry David Thoreau was talking about, which is that there is a root to the problems that we all understand, and the root is this reality of our government. Increasingly, governments around the world, this reality is the deep corruption that affects these governments. That this idea of democracy, which 70 years ago we thought was going to make the world a safe and happy place, this idea of democracy has been deeply corrupted in all sorts of powerful democracies around the world, not just third world or second world democracies, most importantly, first world democracies too. So for example, think about regulations around internet gambling. When internet gambling took off, there were all sorts of people standing up and saying, oh, this is terrible, we've got to stop internet gambling. The United States passed all these rules blocking internet gambling. Blocked to protect the likes of this man, owner of casinos in Las Vegas. We blocked internet gambling. Why? Because they were competing with the casinos in Las Vegas, and we're slowly moving to a world where we're going to enable internet gambling licensed and auctioned off to people like this man running casinos in Las Vegas. Okay, so this example can be multiplied in a million different contexts, and it's especially true to the issues you're going to be thinking about here. Because there is tons of profit that's being enjoyed right now by the oligopolists of our economies that will be threatened by the infrastructure that will be developed here. And those oligopolists will easily be protected from that threat, not by the direct regulation of code, because of course the celebration of the libertarians who talk about the infrastructure of the blockchain is there's nothing they can do about it without shutting down the internet. They're not going to regulate the code, but what they'll do is regulate the actors who want to use the code. What they'll do is they'll say which platforms are prudent platforms for banks or retirement funds or investors to use. And the prudence will be determined in some complicated way, which of course is being driven by the underlying economic interests of those who are driving the policy-making decisions of our governments. So which platforms are prudent, et cetera, and you begin to see the way in which the very opportunity of efficiency and, as my perspective, justice to the developing world is undermined by this potential for regulatory capture that can operate obviously easily in a world where governments are this deeply corrupt. So I am here in part to ask Aaron's question of you. That question here. How do you expect to build the beauty that you are building in these blockchain technologies so long as there is this deep corruption in our democracies around the world? Because, you know, the truth is, if you think about the wide range of policies, not just the ones that you care about, they're really important questions, policy questions. All the hard questions, policy questions that we face as people at the beginning of the 21st century that need sanity for their answers, but have corruption with the answer instead. All sorts of deeply difficult questions which we need to address that we don't have the capacity to address. And I can say that if I were free of this burden that Aaron put on me of spending my life fighting this corruption, I get the attraction, the really sexy attraction that this technology you are building and celebrating, this technology offers. And if I were free of the burden he gave me, I can guarantee I would be at every one of these conferences because this is actually intellectually much more interesting and powerful and has greater hope than the deeply depressing work that I do for a day job fighting the deep corruption that is the nature of our democracies. And indeed, I think this is what Aaron would have done too in this really extraordinary paper. I'm not sure how many of you saw this paper. It really was, for me, the clearest articulation to understand the way in which the proof of work system works, right? This paper written, apparently according to his blog, just a little bit after the Satoshi paper was written. He unfortunately never footnoted any of his work, so it's not clear to me whether he knew of the Satoshi paper when he wrote it or not, but the point is, Aaron loved this infrastructure and idea too. He would have been here with you. So if you don't believe that this is the most important job, the job that Aaron got me to do, that's fine, because the work you're doing I think is incredibly important. I'm not trying to recruit you away from it. Indeed, what I want you to do is to show us in the infrastructure, the platform that you build, what smart, public, and uncorrupted policy could be. What I hope you'll do is to teach us that it's possible, because there are so few places where anybody looks at what governments or bodies like this do, where they are convinced that public regarding policy to make the world a better, more just, more efficient place is even possible anymore. That's the blue note. That's the end of my talk. Thank you very much. So do you want me to take questions? Great, so I'm happy to take some questions, not really hard ones, kind of easy questions. Okay, hard questions then. Okay, right there, hard question.
For whatever it's worth, Aaron did know about Shitosi's paper when he wrote the raw thought thing, because we talked about it.
Fantastic.
That's it.
Good to know. Thank you. Right here.
Thank you, Lawrence. That was amazing. So I have a question about, which I've asked a couple of times today, which is about how can we try and do things differently this time around? What are some of the key areas to consider in building the infrastructure in a way that it can't be as easily sort of corrupted, if you like?
Yeah, so the most important thing is exactly what these workshops are doing. Like, there was not, in the beginning of the internet, the time that these policies were being discussed, these kinds of conferences that are so self-consciously about bringing, banks and government officials and technologists into the same room to talk about these problems, right? Those early conferences, and I first met Aaron when, I would go to these internet conferences. He would be sitting where you are. He was about the age of 12 or 13. His parents would be sitting next to him, had been going with him all across the country to these internet conferences. They would be filled with Barlow types, just sort of talking about the great utopia that would be built, and those government regulators, those people of flesh and steel, they're all going to be destroyed. And there was, from the government's perspective, this stupid tool, this little toy, the internet. Even in 1995, remember IBM writes this paper about how internet's never going to replace the infrastructure of networking that IBM has. And it's only in 1995 that Bill Gates finally, in April of 1995, wakes up to what the internet's going to be. So the point is, in this time, there was this complete diminution of the importance and lack of engagement. But what's happening here in the series of these workshops works exactly against that. And to watch this sort of respectful conversation and openness to this as a potential, I think, is the first step to hopefulness. And then what I was describing as a very practical way to think about it is to begin to build the discipline of wargaming. Like, okay, what happens when Ethereum makes the following kind of affordances possible? Like, what happens as the following what do we do about it? Like, and how do you imagine the government sort of interacting with that? One example that Primavera and I have been talking about for the last 6 months has been, we sort of framed it, I guess, as the child porn hack. I mean, people talk about the 51% attack. The child porn attack, I think, is much more devastating, right? So the child porn attack is, imagine embedding into the blockchain something which can be rendered using code as child porn. So now every time you distribute the blockchain, you're distributing child porn, which means anytime so somebody who wants to destroy your blockchain does that and then goes to a court and said, this is a child porn delivery device, and any server carrying it is liable in America, strict liability for that kind of distribution, right? Well, if it's embedded into the blockchain, you're not going to be able to undo it. What do you do now? Right? There's a very practical way in which you can see the kind of very strict, unbending law. Child porn in America is like one of those things that, it's almost as bad as immigrants or terrorism in the United States right now, right? So, you're not going to see the law bending to that. It's, if anything is going to get crushed, it's that blockchain, right? So the point is, begin to play out those games to talk through what happens. How do you think about evading or avoiding that kind of conflict? What kind of changes have to happen to make that conflict, no longer devastating, and begin to facilitate the development of that policymaking towards that understanding?
That's actually already happened twice in the Bitcoin history.
I'm not sure who's talking. Oh, right there.
Yeah.
That's happened twice?
Yeah, it's already in the blockchain.
And so the courts have ordered...
It was just ignored.
By whom?
It was brought up several times, but I believe it's never been, discussed. It's never been put to that. It's been publicly discussed, but never in a court.
Right, but the point is, when in the United States, if you're an attorney general and you're trying to make a political career, the thing you do is you prosecute child pornographers. So I can tell you, Pennsylvania court attorney general discovered that there was a blockchain out there that could be rendered as child porn. This would make his day. And he would go and he would bring a federal action about this immediately, and then you'd have an issue. Lots of, of course, there's tons of child porn out there that's not prosecuted. I'm not saying whenever something's up there. I'm just saying it is structurally, strategically, a great opportunity to try to attack something you're trying to bring down, much easier than seems to me a 51% attack could be.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you for sharing your burden with us, I hope that the engagement of the community can help you be a little bit more free of that burden.
Thank you for that.
I also was particularly, I thought it was particularly apt, your framing of the acoustic separation. It puts a fine point on a question I've been worried about with respect to these code-based contracts, which is where's the mercy, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's another way of framing it. Laws, the Anglo-American tradition, for a long time had two different courts. And in a very, sexist, stereotypical way, this is the way they described themselves. There was the man's court. That was the court of law. The court of law was a son of a bitch. It's like, there's no forgiveness. You break the rule, you're thrown in jail, your contract, all your property is taken. And then in the, again, self-consciously sexist framing that for many years was the way we talked about it, the court of equity was, the forgiving mother. It was like you came to the court of equity and said, oh, it's so harsh, the rule's too harsh, you've got to get me out of it, and the court of equity would do that. And some people would look at that and say, this is absurd, you've got these two inconsistent, conflicting jurisdictions. But it wasn't absurd, it was just a more sensible way to understand how to bring out the best in the legal system. Sometimes it's great to be absolutely clear, but there's no reason to be unmerciful when the person who's committed the crime hasn't committed the crime with a self-conscious awareness or in circumstances which you ought to be forgiving of it. And so this is the way these things were built in. I don't know how you do it in the context of the automated contracting system, which is again why I don't think the automated contract system will ever be exclusive, because it's going to need that other part.
Lawrence, I was attracted to the courts of equity, so I sort of started law as an equity lawyer. Now I'm a regulatory lawyer. The way in which blockchain is described is more like the court of law rather than the court of equity because of this rigidity in it. It seems unnatural and sort of inconsistent with the way in which we're in a very sort of dynamic and agile world. Do you want to make a comment on that?
Yeah, so dynamic and agile isn't necessarily inconsistent with being strict, right? You've got very strict rules for the dynamic agility of responding to whatever circumstances there are. And my belief is, to say that the blockchain can't be complete is not to say it's not dominant or incredibly significant. And all sorts of kinds of contracting relationships would be enormously helped if we could imagine building in this kind of automated ways to deal with it. I teach contract, for 20 years I've taught contracts, so it's very deep in my recognition of the value and the efficiency that this efficiency would bring. It's just the insistence that you not build this or imagine you're going to build this sort of in John Perry Barlow's, utopia, in free from the, people of weary giants of steel and flesh. The weary giants of steel and flesh will need to interact in a very obvious way because the completeness of this infrastructure cannot be sustained if the infrastructure wants to be as robust as traditional contract law is. And robust here means living with the ambiguities and incorporating and satisfying the system even though there are ambiguities and recognizing they're unavoidable if you want to bring about the most that contract can do. Yeah.
Hi, not a question, but a suggestion that all political donations and special favors should be recorded on the blockchain with real names and only released, funds should only be released with multi-sigs with the oversight committee. Yeah,
so there's a very strong movement. Where is that person who spoke? Was that God who spoke? Because I don't want to oh, okay, there. So now I know it's not God. I can disagree with it. So there's a very strong tradition, especially in America, that says the solution to the problem of corruption is just transparency. And I am, of course, a supporter of transparency, but I'm not a believer that transparency solves the problem. You remember when the Deepwater Horizon blew up and there was all that oil spewing into the Gulf, and somebody had, there was that little webcam down there so you could see all the oil spewing into the Gulf, no doubt the webcam was a great thing. But it's kind of a confusion to think that the solution to that problem would just be a high-def webcam, right? The solution to the problem is to stop the oil from spewing into the Gulf. And it's the same thing here. The solution to the problem is to stop a system of privately funded campaigns, right? So that candidates are not bending over backwards. And members of Congress spend 30 to 70% of their time raising money to get their party back into power, to win their campaign. And when you spend that amount of time raising money, you are very sensitive to the wish or the desires or the hopes of that tiny fraction of the 1% funding your campaigns. So the solution to that is not so that we know precisely who gave you what, which is a good thing to know. It's that we stop that way of funding campaigns so that they can be independent enough to make their judgments. Now, for most people around the world, you can't quite believe, if you're not American, you can't quite believe this is the way the system is. Americans have just kind of come to accept this is the natural way of things, and they can't believe in the rest of the world there's such a thing as public funding of elections, or campaigns that don't run 24/7 from one election to the next election. Like, they just think that's what democracy is. But in the rest of the world, you have much more robust systems for regulating this particular flavor of the corruption. I think there are other kinds of corruptions that evolve, but this particular one that really destroys the American democracy is not one that many other countries have.
I don't know if it's on, but I really appreciated your talk, and I think absolutely on the one hand, we don't want regulatory capture, but we do want good regulation, right? We want new technologies, be it blockchain, be it internet, to serve public value. And we want private value to also be developed in a way such that it doesn't hurt the public value. And so that's a very hard line to walk. And it's a really interesting challenge to all of us in the room, is from whatever perspective you're sitting, whether it's regulatory or private sector or tech, which is private sector, how do you actually walk this tightrope when you don't have faith in current institutions, when there's an underlying quote unquote corrupt structure, but that's still better than anarchy. So given the incentives that we have, you're either a regulator or you're a private sector technology or a potential user like a bank, whatever. How would you suggest that the private developers of this technology work on solving a problem in a way that building a blockchain that serves a public value, that is regulated in a good way, but that isn't subject to regular capture, and it would be if it were developed under the current framework? It just seems like very, very difficult, and I'd love to hear how you would go about doing that, given that the people developing this are private actors.
Yeah, so great question. This is one of the great opportunities of this being such an international process. The strategy is to play one government against another. Okay, so when you're talking about intellectual property, in particular copyright rules, the United States is an insane, drunken grizzly bear, right? There's no balance or judgment beyond maximal protection for as long and as strong as possible. But there are other countries around the world where they see the reality that that's stupid and crazy. What's been really powerful and effective is when those governments have stepped up and said to the United States, this is a little bit too far. You're going too far here. And so the informed governments not living within a system that depends on Hollywood to fund campaigns, where they don't have that kind of industry, are able to create some check on the craziness of, and I think that's what's going to happen here. Again, to the extent you've got policymakers here who are sitting down and not deeply connected to Wall Street, for example, but still have their own financial system, who are thinking about what would really help us improve the efficiency of the way money gets transferred or developed in the system, they would be freer to talk about what makes sense than policymakers in the United States who are so keen to please the tiny number of funders of congressional campaigns in the United States who come from Wall Street, right? So it's playing one government against another in a context of serious policymaking conversations by people who take doing the right thing as their objective, that I think will bring about some kind of sanity in this. Now, That's not to say we're going to get the right answer without fixing the deep corruption that is government. Right? So I don't want to let you off the hook. I say I don't want to recruit you the way Aaron threw me into this miserable life. I don't want to recruit you to that. But I do think you need to tithe. I think you need to give like 10% of your cycles to this problem. You need to think about, what can I do in my own context to raise salient awareness about the deep failure of democracy around the world, right? Because if we don't find a way to get it back, to get some faith in a democratic process back, then I've been in contexts where very rich people say things like, democracy had its run, it failed. We need to become more like China and have a bunch of technocrats running our, and there's a lot of deep skepticism about this basic system because of its failure. And, I don't want to give up on it. I want to fix it. And I think, we need at least 10% of your cycles to fix it too. Yeah, thanks. Somebody has a mic in the back, yeah.
Is there a way to answer that question, to pivot, and to actually look at past revolutions and to extract ourselves from being practitioners of digital or law or the internet, but to do a review almost going back to the French Revolution and beyond, and to see by design, by deconstructing them, what worked and what failed those revolutions from a pure political perspective?
Yeah, so here's where being cognizant of technology is really important. So what the French Revolution could do, and what the American Revolution could do, is have a revolution without jackbooted men with machine guns and tanks standing up to them, right? There's no hope for that kind of revolution in the world today. In the United States, when we had the Occupy movement, it was really astonishing to see the level of police force and brutality directed against these protesters to force them to conform and to behave and to make their protest as insignificant as they possibly could make it. The sort of oppression which the framers of my country would have just found outrageous is natural because of the incredible power of military technology. So I think the ideas that come from that period are really valuable and important. And in the American tradition, I try to mine them and use them all the time to get people to recognize why a change is necessary. But the idea that we're going to have a revolution in the sense that the framers of our Constitution did is just, I think, not on the table. Like, there's a certain point, America's first Constitution failed. Something called the Articles of Confederation was a complete failure. And in 1786, Congress was a complete failure. The leaders basically said, well, to hell with this. They went to Philadelphia. They sat in a room, had a secret meeting over the summer, and they drafted a new constitution. And then they brought it out and they said, here's the new constitution. They sent it out to the states, and the states ratified, and that became the new constitution of the American government. If somebody did that today, that would be treason. That's like, you can't imagine changing the government except within the terms of the existing system. And the terms of the existing system are, corrupted. That's the whole problem. So I love the inspiration of the ideas, but I think we need to be realistic about the potential given the really violent nature of governments defending themselves today.
Firstly, thank you. Thank you for coming to Sydney. It's really, really inspiring. I don't know what's wrong with the microphone. Yeah? Okay. Yep. Do you think blockchain-based smart contracts could offer an opportunity to transform the legal profession, the legal industry, by, first of all, digitizing the rules within contracts, and second of all, by forcing us to reimagine what the law actually is, if it was fully digitized? Yeah. And not necessarily fully automated, but at least fully automized to begin with.
Yeah, so I realized at the end of the talk that this wasn't clear enough in what I think. So if I could choose between the existing system of contract law, not blockchain system, contracts written on paper and courts arguing about the meaning of it, or a purely automated blockchain contracting world, which would I think is more efficient? Absolutely, the blockchain world is more efficient. All that I was saying is that efficiency notwithstanding, don't build it so that all it can be is that blockchain world, because you will lose really important opportunities of flexibility and blah, 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 if you build it just like that. So I absolutely believe that you're going to radically improve the very nature of contracting as the lawyers are forced to be rigorous about the stuff that they can be rigorous about. So when I'm saying there's ambiguity built in, that's not to say all the ambiguity is intentional or even justifiable. A bunch of it is just sloppiness or laziness or a refusal to think about things. But as we imagine generations of development here, and more importantly, as we imagine courts being informed enough to understand them, I do think you're going to see incredible improvement in the efficiency here that will begin to change the nature of the way contract law works. And most importantly, make contract law relevant to ordinary people, right? Because right now, the cost of litigating mean that, for the vast majority of people, contract law is irrelevant. Contracts breached by your car dealer, you're not going to hire a lawyer at $400 an hour who's going to go file a lawsuit against your car dealer, because in America, you can't even get the legal fees back. So forget it. But if you begin to make it this very efficient technology, then these applicability of the law all the way down becomes much easier, because the cost of actually making it enforceable against everybody is much lower. So yes, deep efficiency gains are on the table here. I'm just saying, don't be Barlow-esque in imagining that it's going to live completely independent of the traditions of the way the law deals with these contract questions.
Do you think that the do not track revolution is a way in which we can actually start to influence corruption?
Corruption. So you mean do not track in the sense of like on the net, do not track? It might, depending on other countries and their pathology around democracy. It's not the core pathology in the United States. The core pathology, in my view, in the United States is the way we fund campaigns. And that's the core thing. That's not going to be affected by do not track. Do not track forces a change in the business model of funding, technologies, because you no longer have the ability to take that data and commercialize it through, the obvious ways in which commercial advertising pays people. I've been, one of the things I'm most excited about from this conference has been learning more about the Enigma project at MIT, which I think will facilitate a radical change in the way data gets used in this context that might obviate the need for do not track. So I'm not saying that we're at the end of history with regards to how we're going to fund, and so do not track might be one part of bringing about that change. But it's not the corruption in the government that I'm focused on.
Oh, hi, thanks for your talk. Just getting back to the topic of revolution, I suppose, and something that you spoke about, which was a strategy of playing off states against one another. An economist or a political theorist, Albert Hirschman, wrote a very nice book, Exit, Loyalty, and Voice, or some combination of those words. So I'm wondering your thoughts on whether these emergent economies, or call them states, that may form on blockchains is more a model of revolution or secession.
Yeah, so the early internet thought was very Hirsch-like in this. So Barlow and others, basic argument was, it's going to be a wonderful utopia because if you don't like the rule set of the community you're living in, you can just move to another one. And that competition among these different communities will make all communities better. And this will be the perfect place to test all this. But the reality, of course, is that he was ignoring the fact that we don't live just in cyberspace. While we're in cyberspace, we're also here in the real world. And here in the real world, the state is worried about what the behavior in cyberspace is doing to us and how it's changing us as we interact with people in the real world. And so the plasticity of communities is not what not as perfect as this model, postulates. Now, I do think you're going to see some innovation that's going to come from different countries offering different legal environments for people to be developing their blockchain-like infrastructures, and you'll see some competition among jurisdictions. But that's not necessarily a great thing. There's often you see a race to the bottom in this kind of competition among jurisdictions that might benefit the jurisdiction locally, but creates great harm to the rest of the world by consequence of that. One way to understand cheap products in countries like China is that they get the benefit of very bad environmental laws that makes it easier for them to produce at lower costs than other countries. You wouldn't say that's a good thing. You would say that's just the consequence of them having the freedom to have a different rule set from the rest of us. So that's not a guarantee that this is going to be better, but I do predict with you that you're going to see that kind of competition, and that competition might produce insights for better ways to regulate. It's possible, right? So if you have countries like Iceland right now, which are very tuned into the dynamics of this in a powerful and smart way, I think they're going to be developing infrastructure for thinking about regulation of this that will be useful and informative for other countries to follow, because I think it will be close to the right regulatory infrastructure. But that's no guarantee. Iceland is just one of, 190 other nations.
Well, unfortunately, we have to move on to the last two mini panels of the day, but you'll have a chance to, again, hear from Lawrence Lessig. I'd like to thank you again for being here and move on.